This is the title slide of my presentation. You see it's about communication equity for individuals with hearing loss at recovery stage. We'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So as I was mentioning, there are a variety of different services that come up during the recovery stage. So that could be disaster case management, long-term recovery group, maybe this is like some debris cleanup services or housing assistance, crisis counseling, any number of services that could come up during the recovery stage. Things that are provided to survivors or people who have lived through these disasters. All of these services include some sort of communication with those survivors. Next slide. So that communication that's being provided should be inclusive. It should not be a challenge for those people. People should be able to access the same level of services as anyone else that doesn't have hearing loss. I will go to the next slide. This is just to give you a little bit of a picture of the numbers of people we're talking about when we say people with hearing loss. So it's estimated that about 1.2 million people just in North Carolina have hearing loss. And that doesn't talk about the degree of hearing loss. It could be anywhere from a mild to profound hearing loss. But this also only counts people over the age of 18. This does not count minors that may have hearing loss. When you start talking about the aging population, 65 to 75, it's almost 30% of that population. And for people over 75, we're talking about 46% of those people will have some degree of hearing loss. And the number, like the population of people expected to have hearing loss in North Carolina by the year 2030 is expected to go up to over 1.6 million. So we also know that there are, of that group, about 775,000 who are what we would classify as hard of hearing. Now, there are a lot of reasons for those large numbers. For one, North Carolina is a fairly popular retirement state. So we expect there to be more people coming this way. But there are also the baby boomer generation that are aging. And so many more of them may be experiencing hearing loss. Also, noise exposure is a significant contributor. Loud music, loud workplaces, all those things can over time contribute to hearing loss. Another group is veterans. About 63% of veterans returning from active duty have some kind of hearing loss, 63%. So for all of those reasons, and North Carolina has several military bases as a large veteran state, a large veteran population, we're seeing increases in that number. If we can go to the next slide, please. So we talk about that huge number of people that have hearing loss. Also need to understand there is a wide variety within that. It's not one group. And there's not one size that's going to fit all as far as solutions. So on one side of the slide, the left side, you see kind of what we define as 4 broad categories of people with hearing loss. Deaf, hard of hearing, deafblind, and late deafened. People who we say are deaf typically are born deaf or they lose their hearing very early in life. More likely to use American Sign Language. People who are hard of hearing could have been born with some degree of hearing loss or lost some of their hearing as a child, but still rely a lot on their hearing and speech. There may be some people who are deaf-blind, which means that they have both vision and hearing loss that impact their communication. And when you think about deaf-blind, there's also degrees of hearing loss and degrees of vision loss. So don't think of just completely deaf and completely blind. There may be some that have some vision and no hearing, or some hearing and no vision, or anywhere in between. Right? And then the last group we talk about is late deafened. Those are people who could become deaf at any time later in their life. Maybe they were 14 or 30 or 50 or 60, but they lost their hearing later after they already acquired a spoken language. They develop speech, that's what they rely on, and then they lose their hearing. That is the group that we call late deafened. So they've already developed some sort of spoken language since birth, rely on their hearing to interact with people, communicate, and interact with the world and the environment, and then lose that suddenly. Any child that is born with hearing is going to kind of just passively begin picking up information and picking up language, which is what makes those groups kind of distinct from deaf, who have no hearing from birth or very close to it. And you see all of the arrows all over the screen here. Those are kind of linking up to some of the different possible communication options that people could use. For a lot of deaf people, they use sign language. Some hard of hearing people may or may not use sign language. Some deaf people may use their voice, and some may not. Depending on how much hearing someone has, they may use a hearing aid or a cochlear implant, or they may have no hearing whatsoever. So all of these different things are going to equate to different language needs. So some people may like to use captioning, where they're going to be reading an English transcript of whatever someone's saying. Some people use personal amplification devices that can amplify specific sounds or just the sound in a particular room or area. We'll talk more about that later. Maybe they're using an interpreter like I am today. The interpreter can speak in English for those of you who don't know American Sign Language, whatever I'm communicating, and then vice versa. Also, for someone who's deaf-blind, they may use tactile sign language, where someone's actually signing in a way that they can feel that with their hands. Someone may like to use written communication, type or write back and forth. So there's a huge variety in the communication accommodations or communication modes that may be best suited to a particular person. So my first suggestion to you is ask the person what works for them, because one size does not fit all. And we'll go to the next slide, please.
Donna, Al put in the chat that a few years ago he got a Show Me communication tool for emergency shelters from North Carolina Department of Public Safety, which he describes as a booklet that helps communications with pictures.
Yes, I am familiar with those. That is that is a visual communication tool that can be used. That's another good example of something that you could use, depending on the context. Oops, excuse me, just a moment. I've got one right here. It's called the Show Me book. This is actually downloadable as well. You can download it or print it. There's an app for it. I may talk a little bit more about that later, but I would highly recommend that you guys get that if you can.
I will share some experiences for my agency, the abbreviation for which is DSDHH, Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. So I'll start with some of our successes. Long-term recovery group, which, well, actually, before I go ahead, we have 7 regional centers. We have 3 that cover the eastern part of North Carolina that I'll talk about the coverage a little bit more later. Now, because of the Hurricane Matthew and Florence, my staff worked together with the long-term recovery groups, educating them about communication needs, communication gaps. We did loan pocket talkers to one of the groups. Pocket talker is an assistive listening device. And you'll see a picture on the slide coming up later. But that was able to work in the group for one individual. We had one county emergency management system had a contract with a video remote interpreting agency. What that means, video remote interpreting, is when you have a computer or with a webcam, or it could be a tablet. and a microphone to make it accessible. Then the emergency management staff had a contract with that agency. And it's the same concept with maybe you have a language translation service that you've used in the past, a spoken language. So you've had a contract with an agency. Many of those companies also include American Sign Language interpretation as well. But that would be by video. And again, that depends on the individual county emergency management if they have that set up. So this one happened to have one. And that was they didn't have other languages. So they had to sign a specific contract with one that provided ASL services. Anyway, we were able to loan the tablet to the DSS county so they could use that during their disaster food stamp, the DSTAP program. And that was nice for them to be able to get that. One deaf survivor received housing and supplies. Some of the staff our staff have provided training to other staff providing those recovery services as well. The last bullet there, I don't know if you guys remember, 1 year after Hurricane Florence, they set up a town hall meeting. I think maybe they did 20 of them in 20 different towns out in the East. And my agency did provide interpreters, sign language interpreters for those events and captioning service as well. So to explain what captioning looks like, there'll be a separate screen set up and someone is there in real time typing out what is being said so individuals can access the information through the text. So that was nice. Some of the challenges. We've heard there's no interpreter been provided during case management meetings, any of the recovery services and DSNAP. There was one particular situation where a survivor mentioned that the case manager called or they said, I want to have a meeting tomorrow with you, but that's not enough time to secure an interpreter for a meeting. So that was difficult. They ended up meeting and communicated by writing back and forth. But for that survivor was, they were very frustrated. They were already in an emotional, negative emotional state of mind, and that added to their frustration, having to work through those communication issues. And she was also a single mother. So that was a frustrating incident. I have a personal story. My mom's home flooded during Hurricane Florence, and I had to take care of her home and the paperwork and all the recovery going after that. So I did go into DSNAP. I waited in the line. I filled out all the forms for my mother. And, I told them I needed an interpreter. And they pulled a staff member in who knew how to sign, who knew some sign language, but they were not a trained, qualified interpreter. And they told the staff member, said, just handle the DSNAP. So, and told them to act as an interpreter, but she in fact was not. So they ended up taking care of the application for my mom. I filled out everything. I mean, it was emotional for me as well, but a lot of the information I didn't understand. So the important takeaway here is you need to pull in a qualified professional interpreter. For many people, their first language is not English. Their first language will be American Sign Language and not English. So when you have to access all the information through text, it's very frustrating. And that's very emotional for our group. I also have noticed that many recovery services agencies are not familiar with our agency, NCDHHS. They don't know about us. I do remember there was one county worker and they reached out to the state level to develop a partnership. And so I ended up talking with her at the state level, and they were thrilled to find out about us, but they were looking at, but they could not figure out how to get in touch with us or what our services were. So we all know that the DSNAP announcements go out over audio waves. A lot of times that happens at last minute. There's the stations are set up on a temporary basis. So a lot of us miss where those sites are going to be. We don't know the times that are open. We don't know which days of the week they're going to be there. So it's important for my agency to be involved. So I would, so that's my role, to develop a relationship with, I'm forgetting the name because they've changed the name several times. Is it the Division of Wellness and Child something now? But anyway, it's important for us to have a relationship with them as the agency. So when they are announcing information like the DSTAP sites, that my staff are able to, get that information out to our community members. Description of damage on the application. So there was one hard of hearing blind individual, and her home, the ceiling was leaking from damage, and she went ahead and applied with FEMA. And I believe she called, if I remember correctly, but her application was denied. It was rejected. She had to look for a ride to get to the disaster recovery center, and then explain to them, the person who worked there, I'm blind. I can't see what my damage is. Something's coming from the ceiling, but I don't see what any of the damage is. So someone had to come out and do an assessment of what the damage was, and then explain what was going on to them put on the application. I think she finally got help to repair that. So these are just some examples of things that come up. And many deaf, hard of hearing community members are not aware there's even something called recovery services. We mentioned it to several people and say, no, here's the resource. Here's where you need to go. So that's very important we do that outreach. Now, as I mentioned earlier, many agencies are just unaware that we're even here and what we provide, especially what services we can provide during the recovery period. We are happy to, we have resources. We provide consultation. We provide advocacy for individuals or an agency. We can work with you before, during, and after, especially to set up your communication plan. In fact, do you even have a communication plan? Do you have a process for that in place? What would you do in the case that someone showed up and they didn't speak English, right? Do you have those plans in place? And if so, have you added people with hearing loss into that communication plan? If you notice the picture in the middle, the communications kit, there's a few things you can add to that kit, and we're happy to work with you to develop that. Things I've been hearing over the past year is after people have gone through a disaster and are in the recovery period, they may have lost their hearing aid or it's been damaged, and they don't know that they can reach out to us to get a replacement for that. We do have an equipment distribution program, which is related to telecommunications or telephone equipment, but we also do provide hearing aids. So if an individual have received a hearing aid or a phone equipment from us in the past and it's lost in a disaster, they can reach back out and get that replaced. Even if it's not during disaster, if a person is low income and qualifies, then they can reach out to us and get that. We also have loaner programs for some of our equipment as well. The top right, that device, I mentioned Pocket Talker earlier. That's what that looks like. It's a simple device with a microphone and a headset that just amplifies noise in a certain area. That wouldn't be great for group settings. That's more of a one-on-one. There's different type of loops and different type of information. So you can reach out to us to get that equipment. And as I mentioned, the loaner program, we do have hearing aids for people that can't afford them. They have to pay for the fitting of the hearing aid themselves, but the hearing aid itself will be free. Reach out to us for more information related to that. Exercise and drills. Have you had, if you do an exercise or a drill for the disaster, ahead of a disaster, we're happy to come out to consult and give you feedback and check for areas that are missing or gaps. We have something called a different world exercise that our staff come out and do. So we come out and train your staff about what it feels like to be in the shoes of someone who's deaf and hard of hearing. We basically set up different stations or booths, if you will, and have people go through those experiences as if they were deaf and hard of hearing. So any other information about effective communication, how to do that, we will come provide intensive training on that. And all of this I'm talking about is free through the state, and we travel. Earlier, I mentioned that we have 7 regional centers serving all 100 counties in North Carolina. You can see here that each center serves X number of counties depending on their area. We have offices in Asheville, Morganton, Greensboro, Charlotte, Raleigh, Wilson, and Wilmington. If you reach out to one of these regional offices, I suggest you ask for our staff person called a community accessibility specialist. Their primary role is collaboration with community members, agencies, doing consultation on access and emergency management, other things of that nature in these regional centers. If you're unsure of who to contact, please reach out directly to me and I'll put you in touch with the right person. Again, I work at the state level in our administrative offices. Next slide. Here's access to our webpage. And specifically a web page on communication tips that you can find here. Go back one, please. Yeah, there you go. The communication resource page. We have just in time, quote unquote, videos in there about effective communication, specifically for emergency responders. So how to address a situation where you come into someone with a hearing loss during a disaster. So some of these videos may help you there. There's different scenes, different scenarios, and different ways to communicate with people with hearing loss. We also have FAQs there as well, and information that you can hand out about how to communicate with people over telephone, clear mask, so seeing through for lip reading. All the information is right there on the website. If you notice something yourself that's missing and should be added, you can let us know. Happy to add that. This brand new website was just up this past spring, so we're excited about that. Okay. Now, in conclude, the key takeaways from today's presentation, an important part is if you meet with a consumer and they seem to be struggling with communication in some way, and you feel like it may be hearing loss, just ask, do you have a hearing loss? Some people will admit that or let you know, and then you can ask, well, what's the best way to communicate? Or they may tell you what the best way to communicate with them is. Now, some may be resistant. They may not disclose a hearing loss. They could be still in denial. embarrassed, and they do not want to advocate for themselves, for their communication needs. And so just try to ask those questions. No one, and then remember, once you do ask them how to communicate, remember, not one size fits all. So I would encourage you to be assertive too. If someone is denial, but you still think it's not going well, they're not understanding, please try some other ways yourself until it seems like the situation is getting better. And just figure out the best thing for that situation. Again, we're here to provide support in that case, that you can't figure it out, and provide more information about communication access. People with hearing loss have equal rights to receive service just like anyone else who doesn't have hearing loss. Okay, next. If you have any questions, absolutely feel free to contact me. All my contact info is here. Phone, email is fine. Now that phone number is voice only, so that number cannot be texted. That's going through a relay service that connects with an interpreter before it comes to me. Okay. You'll see my text number we do correspond through email, and we can go forward that way as well. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. All I had to say. If you have any questions, again, I'm happy to answer them.